Good evening from Manchester. This afternoon at Preston Crown Court, Judge Thane Forbes, visibly upset, told Dr Harold Shipman, life must mean life. He continued, I have little doubt that each of your victims smiled and thanked you as she submitted to your fearful administrations. The trial, which lasted 57 days, was restricted to 15 charges of murder. There's no doubt that Dr Shipman is guilty of many more, but the prosecution felt the jury would not cope with any more cases at one trial. Tonight, I'll be talking to relatives of victims and suspected victims who want to find out how this could have happened. All the evidence was there. 5 of the 15 women he's been convicted of murdering died in his surgery. Normally, doctors have no such deaths. He signed 70% of his death certificates. Normally, it's no more than 30%. And somehow, although his prescribing record was monitored, he managed to stash away enough diamorphine for 1,000 fatal doses. Tonight, West Pennine Health Authority said it had immediately suspended its medical advisor. And tomorrow, the government is expected to announce a public inquiry. Here's David Lomax.
The result is the right result. It was the only result that could possibly have been. My mother trusted Dr Shipman. He cynically and callously betrayed that trust.
The Crown Prosecution Service, the police and prosecuting counsel have worked together to bring to justice the most prolific serial killer this country has known.
Sadly, nothing that's happened here, nor can happen in the future, can bring back my mum and all the other victims. We hope we can now have the space and the time to remember my mum as she was, a happy, active, caring, energetic, loving person, whom we miss so much.
This is the suburb of Hyde on the southeast fringes of Manchester. Dr Shipman lived here, married with 4 children, hard-working and apparently well-liked. In 1993, he set up his own one-man GP practice in Hyde. At some time after this, he started killing certain patients by injecting them with morphine or diamorphine, the medical name for heroin.
I'll advise to stand and let you take a photograph and then go on. And I'm sure you've had enough time to take a decent photograph.
He falsified computerized medical records, he entered false information on his victims' death certificates and lied to their families. Dr Shipman had about 3,200 patients on his books. The police have now looked at 136 suspicious deaths among these patients. The local coroner estimates that the total number could be 150. Dr Shipman's victims were middle-aged or elderly women living alone. None was terminally ill, none was being prescribed morphine or diamorphine. All of them died unexpectedly. All of them had been seen by Dr Shipman on the day they died. But apart from all these tragedies, which the families are still trying to come to terms with, the whole case raises other questions. Among them, how is it possible that he could get away with so many murders for so long? And what was it in Dr Shipman's makeup which caused him to start killing in the first place? Harold Shipman, or Fred as he was usually known, was born in Nottingham in 1946. He grew up on a council house estate. His father was a lorry driver. His mother died of cancer when he was 17. Fred Shipman was bright academically and went to grammar school and then studied medicine at Leeds University. By the time he was 20, he was married to Primrose Oxterby and had a child. The Shipmans lived in a flat near the university. Dr Bernie Bedford, who's now a GP in Hampshire, was one of Fred Shipman's contemporaries at Leeds.
I don't remember him getting particularly drunk. I don't remember him getting into any trouble. He was very middle of the road, controlled, sensible. Didn't push the boundaries. Didn't appear to try to push the boundaries. Somebody who you would think in the future would be a good, respectable, responsible doctor.
Fred Shipman qualified in 1970 and eventually applied for a GP's job in this group practice in Todmorden in Lancashire. He was the only candidate. Dr Shipman and his wife spent their weekends with a group restoring the nearby Rochdale Canal. Fred helped to dig out a silted lock. Primrose made the tea. But the Shipmans didn't get on well with the other partners. And Dr. Shipman had another problem. He started getting blackouts. They were so bad that his wife had to drive him to his calls. A local chemist then discovered that he'd been prescribing suspiciously large quantities of an opiate drug called pethidine. In a showdown with his colleagues, Fred Shipman had to admit that he'd been abusing the drug.
We got notification that he was not going to surrender his keys to the surgery, and he wasn't going to leave the partnership, and he wasn't going to have treatment. But we took legal advice, terminated the partnership.
In court in 1976, Dr. Shipman admitted that he had forged prescriptions. He said he'd been injecting himself regularly with between 600 and 700 milligrams of pethidine in his arms and legs over a 6-month period. There were 67 offences. He was convicted and fined £600.
When it comes to light that doctors are dependent on drugs, as unfortunately is not too uncommon, then the way to proceed will be for that doctor to stop practicing and for the General Medical Council, the GMC, to be contacted. This would usually result in the doctor having to see a specialist in drug dependence for an assessment. That assessment would include a psychiatric assessment, and then the doctor would stay away from practicing until the General Medical Council had had time to consider their assessor's evaluation of the problem, treatment recommendations, and the likely response to treatment.
Dr. Shipman's case was considered by the General Medical Council. They had advice from the treatment clinic he'd attended and decided to take no action. He wasn't suspended or struck off. He was never monitored or tested. The GMC did nothing to stop Dr. Shipman from continuing to practice as a GP. In Hyde, Dr. Shipman started stockpiling morphine and diamorphine in the same way he'd acquired drugs in the Todmorden practice. In May 1998, he visited one of his patients, Winifred Mellor. After he'd left, a neighbour discovered Mrs. Mellor dead, sitting in her chair with her sleeve rolled up. She had not been ill before. Her death certificate said she died of a coronary thrombosis.
He just breezed past me, totally ignored me. He also never looked at Mrs. Mellor, whose remains were in the chair. She was there dead at the time. And he just immediately went for her daughters and immediately began talking at them rather than talking to them. And his opening statement was, "You do know your mother had a heart condition, don't you?" And she wouldn't accept treatment, and she wouldn't go to the hospital. And almost without pausing said, "Have you got an undertaker?"
She was a healthy, active woman with a full life to lead and plans to fulfill. And he wasn't doing her any favours. If people think he's gone round to these, as people think, elderly ladies, and he's doing them a bit of, it's justice what he's doing, it isn't. It's not just Mum, a lot of the other ladies had full, active lives. He is just an evil man.
Mrs. Mellor might have been saved if a warning sign 2 months before had been acted upon. Before Dr. Shipman could arrange for his victims to be cremated, he had to complete a cremation certificate. This had to be countersigned by another independent doctor who had to say that he or she was satisfied that the death had not been suspicious or unnatural. Now, one of the local GPs in Hyde, who'd been asked by Dr. Shipman to countersign these forms, became suspicious about the number of deaths he was reporting. She took her concerns to the local coroner, who said he was obliged to take them to the police. The police went to the local health authority, who didn't know about Dr. Shipman's previous drug convictions because the GMC had never told them. The detectives had been asked to be discreet, so they didn't confront Dr. Shipman. They didn't